Recording in progress.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Statistics Solutions webinar. Today's webinar is on APA, avoiding common mistakes. I'm going to give probably a minute or two of time for everyone who wants to show up to show up. So I will get started at like 2:01 or 2:02. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. And if anyone else comes in, the first two slides are just overview slides, so they won't miss much. Let me go ahead and get started. If I can share my screen. Sorry, y'all, I'm having issues with Zoom. Okay, here we go. Sorry about that. Awesome. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see my screen. So hello, my name is Kai, and welcome to the Statistics Solutions webinar on APA editing, how to avoid the most common mistakes. This webinar is going to be recorded, so if you want to watch it back, it'll be available within, I think, 24 hours usually. If you have any questions throughout the PowerPoint, please go ahead and ask it in the Q&A section or in the chat. And then I have a Q&A section set up at the end, so I'll answer all questions at the end. Finally, if you want more information on how Statistics Solutions can help you with APA editing or just our full dissertation services, please stick around to the very last slide. I have some information on who to contact. I also have an email here as well, if you would like to contact Janine, who is my boss. Okay. So first things first, APA is the American Psychological Association's rules and regulations for writing research. It consists of kind of two main points, grammar and style, and then references. So we're going to start with grammar and style first, and then move on to references. So the first thing to keep in mind when writing in APA is your writing voice. So APA style prefers the use of an active voice or a structure in which the subject performs an action rather than a passive voice in which the action is not as clear. A good example of this is by using researcher as the subject of the sentence and the action rather than starting with like the study was conducted. So instead, an active voice would be something along the lines of the researcher conducted the study instead of saying the study was conducted. And that's because when you're using this passive voice, you know, conducted by who? We don't get as much information with this passive voice, and we should really be focusing on what the researcher did, and exactly why, how, all of those things. There are some exceptions to this, though. Specifically in chapter 4, the emphasis is placed on the participants rather than the researcher themselves. So chapter 3 and chapter 4, a lot of your emphasis is placed on what are your participants going to do? How are they going to consent to this? What surveys or interventions are they going to be going through? You know, how many people do you need? And then in chapter 4, it's okay, well, what did these participants respond? How did they respond to these questions? How are they changing between these two intervention groups? And so that's kind of the only exception of using an active voice is throughout chapters 3 and 4. But then once you get back to chapter 5, you should go back into an active voice where you're talking about you, the researcher, again as the subject. Okay. Additionally, we want to avoid, I'm really bad at saying this word, but I think it's anthropomorphism. I think I said it right that time. But basically what that means is that you want to avoid speaking as if the study is like has ideas and is like a living thing. So, we don't want to attribute characteristics to these inanimate objects. So we don't want to be speaking as if the study found something or that the article discussed something, because the study didn't find anything. The study's not a person. The researcher who ran the study did find something because they're a human being. So it's really important to make sure that, like kind of in the earlier slide, we're really focusing on what you as the researcher did. I also apologize if there's any background noise of cat scratching. My cat is actually having a meltdown that I didn't let him in the room, but I'm not going to do that now. Okay. So next in grammar and style is tense use. So tense is another very important aspect of APA writing. And that's because certain tenses are appropriate at different times. So in general, if you're in the proposal stage, you should be referring to your study in the present tense and the future tense, as you have not conducted the study yet, but you will soon. Again, this is before you have done, your perspective defense. So it's a lot of in chapter 3, I will, or participants will do this. Participants will see a survey that showed this, and it should all be in future or present tense. However, once your proposal is approved, you actually have to go back and rewrite chapter 3 in the present or in the past tense, to denote that you have conducted this study and that this is what was done. This is the same for the results section as well. The results section should always be written in past tense, unless you're talking about a data analysis plan. And then with a data analysis plan, again, that's going to be future or present tense. Also, you want to avoid using past tense when referring to something that other researchers, always use past tense when referring to something that other researchers found. And that's because those studies have been done in the past. They're not currently happening. They're published studies. So we need to reflect that, something that was run in 2000 should be using the past tense. Okay. So very similar to tense is capitalization. It's similar because certain capitalization rules are appropriate at different times. So when to use and when not to use capitalization is a pretty important distinction in APA style. So capitalization should always be used on major words in titles and headings. Additionally, journal titles and reference titles should always be capitalized as well. And then finally, any instrumentation, tests, or surveys should be capitalized, but not theory names. So say you're looking at the Minnesota multi-factor personality inventory. That is a survey, that's a test, it's your instrumentation. However, if you were thinking of a theory and you're writing about a theory and you say the misinformation effect, which is a theory, that should not be capitalized. Or like if you said something along the lines of like, oh, this theory of, I don't know a lot of theories. I know the misinformation effect because that's what my thesis was on. But, stuff like that. Multi-factor leadership questionnaire, that's your survey instrument. Whereas if your theory is on business, you wouldn't talk about that theory with capitals. So when not to use capitalizations, that is also important. So this last slide was when to use it. And then this is when not to use it. So when not to use it is names of theories, like I said in the last slide, Generic titles of tests. So say you're just talking about a stress test, but you're not naming that specific stress test and you just write stress test. Stress test does not need to be capitalized. Additionally, only the first word of a title of an article in the reference section is going to be capitalized. So in this example here, we're looking at Henderson and not really sure how to say that name. And then if you see after the date and the period comes our title, and only the first word is capitalized. All of the other words, minus the words after this ellipses, is uncapitalized. Also, yeah, shortened or inexact generic titles of tests, names of laws and theories, hypotheses, that kind of thing. Awesome. So abbreviations is next, and these should only be used if the certain title of whatever you're talking about has been mentioned more than 4 times in a paper. So less than 3 times, it should always be written out. And that's because abbreviations can be helpful in saving space within your paper, but you need to make sure that the reader actually understands what that abbreviation stands for. So it needs to at least be clearly defined in your paper once. And so for an example, like say we were looking at the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Say you're only talking about the CDC once or twice in your paper. It's not really that important. It has something to do with some previous studies, but that's not something that you're looking at. Then in that case, you're only talking about it 1 or 2 times. You're going to write out Center for Disease Control and Prevention every single time. However, if your entire crux of your paper is the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, you're going to be writing that statement out a lot. And so if the general rule is that if you're using something more than 4 times, you should clearly define it once. So the first time you use it, it should be clearly defined. And then every time after that, you can use the actual abbreviation. Also for the United States, there is a little bit of difference, between when to use the United States versus the US. So the US as an abbreviation should only be used as an adjective. So for example, the US Navy or the US education system, something like that. However, when you're using the United States as a noun, it should not be abbreviated to the US. So if you're talking about children in the United States, you should not abbreviate that to US. It should just be children in the United States. Awesome. Okay, so the last important rules of grammar and style is numbers. So according to APA rules, you can use numerals when the number is over 10, or if it represents a time, date, or score. So if you're talking about 2 years from now, you can use the numeral 2. If you're talking about 5-year-olds, you can use the numeral 5. And then any number that is 10 or higher, you should be using the numbers. However, you should be spelling it out if none of those things are the case. So if the number is 9 or less, and it's not talking about time, date, scores, you should write it out as a word. So in the sense of talking about, oh, we're talking about 5-year-olds, that 5 is, because we're talking about 5-year-olds, it's going to be a numeral. But then if we're talking about, oh, there were 5 participants in the study, 5 is going to be written out. Okay, so the next biggest aspect of APA is citations and references. And I would argue that this is probably people's biggest issues with APA. And that's just because a lot of APA citation and references rules can be a little tedious, and people get a little bit confused, which is completely valid, but that's what we're here for. So It's important when discussing other people's ideas in work that you don't plagiarize. Instead, you should always be attempting to put the author's ideas into your own words with what's known as paraphrasing instead. A big tip that I always give people when you're taking notes on a research paper is to never directly take those notes from a text. Don't copy and paste into your notes from the text. Instead, you're going to want to write your notes out in words so that you're better able to understand the material if you've encoded it with your own words rather than just copying and pasting. Also, you're less likely to plagiarize that way. Another way to avoid plagiarism is to always cite your sources. So that's probably the biggest way to avoid plagiarism. And so even if it seems like a common piece of knowledge, chances are that it's not, and that you should be citing where you learn this. So I know we all know that the sky is blue, but do you have a reference for that? It's kind of a bad example, but that's something that's known as like a common piece of knowledge, but we don't really, if you're not referencing it, there's no way of proving that it's actually true or that you didn't steal it from someone else. Awesome. And so because we're citing all of our sources of information, we're going to need a reference list. A reference list goes at the end of your paper and it lists out all of the article authors, titles, and date published for the articles within your paper. So this list should be in alphabetical order and it should match up with all of your articles that are in your text. Excuse me. Sorry. I'm going to take a quick sip of water. Additionally, any online sources must also include retrieval information. And so that could be in the form of a DOI, or that could be a form of the actual HTTP link to a website. So the only difference from APA 6th edition to 7th edition when it comes to DOIs is that in APA 6th edition, your DOI format was a little bit different. You would have said retrieved from and then put just the number. Now in APA 7th edition, they want you to put the entire DOI, so not just the number. So if you look here, these X's after .org dash XXXXXX, this would be what the number is. And so in APA 6th edition, you would just write that number. However, in APA 7th edition, they want you to write out the full URL. And so you'd write HTTPS .doi.org dash, and then whatever that number is. So as well as having a reference list at the end, APA also requires that you cite your sources within the text as well. And so there's kind of two ways to do this. So one way is that your citation is the subject of the sentence. And then the other way is that your citation is kind of tacked on to the end of the sentence with parentheses. But other than that, it kind of all goes the same way. So if you're putting it as the reference of the subject in your sentence, or as the subject of your sentence, sorry, you would say something along the lines of Smith et al. In 2012 found that, the misinformation effect was this. Whereas if you're putting the reference at the end of your sentence, you're going to say, the researchers found that the misinformation effect was this, parentheses, Smith et al., parentheses, period. And so there's no right way to do that. It's not, it's one of those things where you can kind of split up how you reference your in-text citations. I personally like to kind of switch it up between using the reference as the subject of the sentence and then putting the reference at the end of the sentence. It's really up to you and how you want to structure your sentences, but both ways would be fine. Also, any source that you cite in text must also be found in the full references section, so at the last couple pages as well. Okay, So then the last thing I wanted to talk about today was just some changes in the APA 7th edition. So it's fairly new. I would say it's about 2 years old now. The 7th edition of APA came out in, I believe, 2020 or 2021. I can't remember. I think it was 2020. And there's just a few changes that are kind of important differences between APA 6th edition and APA 7th edition. And so I wanted to go through those specifically. So first thing that's different is the headings. So now I'm gonna talk about the first 3 headings, and then from there, the rest of the headings are kind of self-explanatory. But level 1 headings are gonna be your chapter titles. So chapter 4, chapter 3, discussion, literature review. It's also going to be if you want to break up your paper into different sections. So say your methodology section, you're doing a quantitative part and a qualitative part. Well, then your quantitative part, you'd probably put quantitative methodology. And then as your level 1, and then further on down later, your qualitative methodology, that would also probably be a level 1 header. From there, your level 2 headers are going to be the headings of the different sections of each chapter. So for chapter 3 specifically, these are going to be stuff like your introduction to the chapter, what's your target population, your data analysis plan, your research questions and hypotheses. So these are going to be flushed left, unlike level 1s, which are going to be centered, bold, title case heading, and then any text that you begin underneath is going to be begin as a new paragraph, also going to be tabbed. Level 3 is if maybe within your results section, within your hypothesis testing section, you had to run some assumptions for your hypothesis test. Maybe the word assumption would be your level 3, and underneath that you would have all of the assumptions for the test that you had talked about above. Your level 3 headings are going to be flushed to the left. They're going to be bold-faced, but this time they're also going to be italicized. And then also text is going to begin as a new paragraph after that. Your level 4 and your level 5 headers don't really come up that often, but sometimes they will and sometimes they do. Level 4 will sometimes come up. And so in that case, it's just going to be indented, bold-faced. It's not going to be italicized. It's going to end with a period. And instead of your text beginning as a new paragraph, this time your text is going to just start right after the period. Same with level 5, except for now those things are bold-faced and italicized instead of not being italicized. Awesome. Some just more grammar and style rules. APA 7th edition has kind of adopted bias-free language. So they now recognize the singular they if the gender of your participants is unknown or irrelevant, or if, that person uses that as their personal pronouns. Also, we're adopting person-first language here. So instead of talking about, a man with epilepsy, you're going to talk about an epileptic man. So person first basically just means that you're putting the person of the subject before their identity. Well, not necessarily their identity, but the other parts of them. So, someone with epilepsy is still a person, even if they have epilepsy. Someone with autism is still a person, even though they have autism. And so, unless your literature is telling you not to use person first language, I know, for example, a lot of autistic people and autistic research does not use person first language, and then some does. It kind of just depends. So unless your research is telling you not to use person first language, it's probably a good idea to be using person first language. So instead of saying, again, another example is people living in poverty, or sorry, instead of the poor, you're going to say people living in poverty. Because again, personhood is first. You want to be really specific if you're talking about Americans? Are you talking about Korean Americans? Are you talking about Asian Americans? Are you talking about, we're talking about men? Are we talking about cisgender men versus trans men? That kind of thing. Okay, so this part I wanted to go a little bit in depth on because I think this slide and the next slide is pretty important. And I would argue that these are kind of the issues that a lot of people have with formatting tables. So the biggest thing about formatting tables is that they are formatted in parallel. And so what that means is that, you know, our columns are going to be our variable names. And then under that are going to be like our numbers or, you know, the categorical variables that we're interested in. And so all of your tables and figures should follow basically the same format. So the first thing that you need is a table label or a figure label. And so that's going to be bolded and it's going to be at the top. It's not going to be a part of the actual table, but it'll be a description above it. So that's going to be table 1, figure 1, table 2, table 3, table 4, table 5, that kind of thing. Your next, you're going to tab down. Your next area is going to be your title. This is going to be italicized, and then you're just going to describe what is going on in the table. So, you know, for this example, participant demographics. Another example could be results for the linear regression between variable X and variable Y. Always has to be italicized. It's not bolded. And this kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier with the capitalization point. If you notice, both participant and demographics are both capitalized. And that's because, like I said earlier, we want to be capitalizing all of our title in our figures and tables. From there, our heading is going to be the top of our table. That's going to be where our variables are introduced, where they're named. And then finally, the body is going to be where your actual data is. And so on this next slide, I wanted to show an example of what an APA formatted table looks like. So, you know, we have our label here, table 2. We have our title, results of curve fitting analysis examined the time course and fixations of the target. That doesn't make any sense to me, but, you know, and each one of these words is capitalized. From there, this is our heading right underneath where it says logistic perimeter. 9-year-olds, 16-year-olds means standard deviations, T, P, colons, D. Those are all your headings. And then from there, your data is underneath. So your variables under logistic perimeter, and then our numbers under means and standard deviations for 9-year-olds and 16-year-olds. Additionally, with tables, we should limit the use of borders. So APA is pretty strict about borders. They kind of hate you using them. Specifically, it is completely off limits to use vertical borders. So you should not be seeing any borders between, like, that go down between mean and standard deviation. You shouldn't see any borders that go vertically between, like, T and P. And really, you should also be limiting your use of the horizontal borders as well. As a general rule, horizontal borders should only be used at the very bottom, the very top, and then to separate the body and the heading. And so in this example, you can see that between maximum asymptote proportion, I don't know why I said proportion so weird, and then between maximum asymptote proportion and crossover in MS, there's not a horizontal border in between those two rows. However, there is a horizontal border separating this header from your actual body. Finally, tables and figures can be placed either within the text of the paper or within the appendix section of your paper. And that's really up to you and your mentor and your committee members. Sorry, some committee members love it for you to put it smack dab in the middle of your paper, and then some say, nope, we're going to put them in the appendices. So either way is fine. APA wise, it's just up to your specific school or your mentor in general. Okay. Insect citations, we talked about those a little bit earlier, just generally, but there are differences between the 6th and the 7th edition. And I think the biggest difference is that any source where you're talking about 3 or more authors, you're going to be using the first author's last name, and then et al. So ETAL dot afterwards. And to me, this is the best thing that APA has ever done to me, because I was getting really incredibly sick of, because previously in APA 6th edition, sorry, I have something in my throat. In APA 6th edition previously, I think it was up to 5 authors. And then after 5 authors, you would use et al. And then now in APA 7th edition, it's only 3 authors. So you're just doing a lot less writing. The only exception to that, sorry, is if 2 papers have the same first author listed and it's like the same date. So say if Smith, like, he's the first author on 2 of these papers and both of these papers were published in 2020. Well, now it's going to be Smith et al. 2020 and Smith et al. 2020, even though those are 2 separate papers. So that's really the only exception. In that case, you would use 2 authors' names. You would write Smith and then whoever the second author is, et al., and go from there. Another way for that exception, you could also use the second author's last name only. So instead of, say it was like Smith and Scanlon and some other random last names that I don't know. And then, if you had 2 Smith et al. Papers, the second one would turn into Scanlon et al. But that's kind of rare. Doesn't really happen that often. At least I don't know that many people who publish multiple papers within the same year, and good for you if you do, because that process is a lot. Awesome. And then actually within your references section, you're still going to include all of the authors up to 20 in the reference list. So only an in-text citation are you going to be using et al. Unless you have more than 20 authors, which is crazy, but it does happen. Also, for the references section, your DOIs and your URLs are going to be presented in hyperlink for electronic sources. So basically, just so that if someone's reading your paper and you have a URL, they're able to click it and immediately just go to the paper. And then, like I said before, you're not using retrieved from anymore when we're talking about DOIs or URLs. Instead, you're just going to put the URL or put the DOI. Oops, sorry. Okay. And then last thing I wanted to talk about is just kind of some helpful tips. So the biggest thing is to keep up with this formatting from the very beginning. It's a lot easier to work on APA formatting if you kind of already have it started out from the very get-go, instead of going back and completely retconning everything that you've already done. Additionally, you should or might want to keep a running list of the references that you have in maybe an Excel sheet, and then regularly check those against your in-text citations, just to make sure that you don't have more references in the reference section than you actually talked about within your paper, or, which is arguably worse, is that you talked about a paper in your paper and then didn't reference it in the reference section. I think that is not a huge issue, but a lot of people, if you're not keeping a running tally along the lines, at the very end, sometimes professors will come back to you and say, hey, I noticed you talked about this within your paper, but I didn't see it in the reference section. Can you make sure all of these are updated? And now at the very end, you're going to have to go through and go, okay, was this in the reference section? Was this in the reference section? Was this in the reference section? Whereas if you're going along the whole time and kind of keeping a running list of these things, it's a lot easier to catch a mistake. Also, citation managers such as EndNote and forget the other ones off the top of my head. They can be really helpful despite some pitfalls. I would say just be careful with using citation managers. Not all of their citations are 100% correct all the time. And so just make sure that if you are using those things, it's not a bad thing to use. They're super helpful, especially if you're on a time crunch. But you know, sometimes it's missing a period or things are capitalized that shouldn't be. So just make sure that you are just cross-referencing those citation managers and whatever they output to you with what you know to be the rules of APA 7th edition. And then finally, I do think it is important to keep a copy of the APA 7th manual nearby. It is a reference manual. It's not something that you're supposed to memorize. I don't think most of the people I know have it fully memorized. I find myself checking in on my manual multiple times a day, even if it's just for like small little, make sure that this is how I'm supposed to be doing it kind of things. It is worth the investment, but there are manuals online as well if you don't want to pay for them. They're going to be less involved because they're probably not through APA, but like Purdue OWL has an amazing APA reference section that is basically as good as the 7th edition manual. So, you know, it's up to you and whether or not you feel like the manual is worth it. But I think it could be. Okay. So I see some questions in the chat and stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and get to those. Let's see. Q&A section. Okay, so the first question is, how do you reference within the paper a over 20 word quote? Yeah, so APA does recommend that you should not be using direct quotes in your paper. Even if you put quotation marks around them, APA finds quoting something directly to be a little bit clunky. And so the best option would probably be to paraphrase that. So if you don't want to just put in quotation mark, you know, 20 word quote, quotation mark, that can feel a little jarring for the reader. And it might be best to reference it as, you know, Smith et al. Or whoever. I don't know why I keep using Smith et al. As an example. I don't know anyone with the last name Smith, but Smith et al. You know, stated that, and then instead of putting the 20 word quote, you would just paraphrase that quote. Okay, hopefully that answers your question, but let me know if it doesn't. Okay. Next question is, what are your recommendations for a table with several columns? How to line up the columns, especially without vertical borders? Yeah, that's a great question, actually. Let me actually go back in my PowerPoint to answer that. So maybe if it lets me go back. So in this case, that's kind of what this example is doing here. There's a lot of columns here. And even though we have our 9-year-olds, we have means and standard deviations kind of under those columns. So in that situation, it's really about formatting. I can't give you the best way to do it all the time because it's going to depend based on, you know, your you know, whatever you're presenting. But ultimately, if you have like a crazy amount of columns, it might be best to separate those tables into 2 separate tables to avoid using vertical lines. If not, if you can't separate those tables, something like this, where you're putting those means and standard deviations under like subcategories, is probably your best bet. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Next question. Could you tell me any guidelines or resources to help us use tenses in different section researches, such as methodology, results, recommendation sections? Totally. So the general rule, like I said earlier, is that in your prospectus, for your methodology, you're going to be using the past or the present and the future tense. And then in your results discussion section, those are all going to be past tense, all the time, always. However, if you are looking for, resources or guidelines, I mentioned earlier, Purdue OWL is a really, really, really good reference for APA 7th edition. I personally love them. If I'm not feeling like looking up stuff in my book, I just look up Purdue OWL. And so I believe they have tense guidelines and when you should not be using those things. Yeah, okay. And then last question is, how can I access an APA 7th edition reference manual? I bought mine on Amazon. So you can find it on Amazon. APA does have a website. You could probably buy it from there as well. Might be a little bit more expensive, but I actually don't know. I don't think I've ever bought anything through APA themselves. But I got it on Amazon. If you're at a university or a school, they should have access to those in your library if you don't want to buy them. If you do want to buy them, I would recommend going to the bookstore at your university, and maybe they have access to buying them if you're not interested in buying it on like Amazon or something like that. Okay. I think, last question. What is blocking? I'm not sure what that is in reference to. Do you mind asking that again or in a different way? Sorry. I don't remember saying that. Anyway, okay. So if anyone has any other questions, please feel free to ask in the Q&A section. But in the meantime, while I'm waiting for more questions, or if nobody has any other questions, I just wanted to talk to everyone a few seconds about our company, Statistics Solutions. So Statistics Solutions is a full service dissertation and consulting company, and we provide graduate students and other researchers with timely editorial support for their dissertations. So we do a lot. Not only do we help with APA editing, but we also help with writing your introduction, your chapter 1, synthesizing your literature review, and writing it into something concise. We work with chapter 3. We work with running your results and then interpreting them. And then we also help with chapter 5 as well. Additionally, we can also help with PowerPoint presentations if you're interested in us having meetings with you to go over your presentation or even to help work on your presentation. We help with that as well. Honestly, we do a lot, and we do a lot to make sure that our students 100% understand what's going on at all times. And so if you are interested in our services, we do complimentary 30-minute consultations, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. Sorry. I have contact Janine Glass at Brittany at Statistics Solutions, but it's actually contact my boss Brittany at Brittany at statisticsolutions.com. She's awesome. She does our sales. She's super helpful, and we'll do a 30-minute consultation. Basically, those consultations consist of just talking about what your research goals are, what your goals are for us helping you, and whether or not we would be able to do something like that. So if you are interested, please contact Brittany, or tell your friends, or your colleagues who may be interested in our services. Okay, I see one or two more chats, so let me look at that. Yeah. Okay. So last question is, can we count on referencing software such as Mendeley for those details? Yeah, Mendeley is one of those APA citing sources that really, it's a really helpful tool. I would say that they probably don't get the references wrong that often. I would still check. I mean, just do a cursory look every time you're putting a reference in your reference section. But Mendeley is, or Mendeley, I don't know how to say it, is a great reference for it. If anyone doesn't know what Mendeley is, basically it synthesizes your research. It kind of keeps all of your articles in the same place, and then it creates citations for your articles, and it's a good way to write notes on your articles and kind of have them all in the same place. Mendeley is awesome. So I think Mendeley referencing would probably be fine. But again, always just check just in case. Our AI is great. We love AI, and that's what Mendeley works on, but it's not perfect. And APA 7th edition is tedious. Okay. Well, that's I think all I had today for you guys. So I'm going to leave this on the screen for another extra minute, just in case anyone wants to write the phone number down or the email. Like I said, please refer us to your colleagues if you think they would be interested. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their Tuesday. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop the share and go ahead and stop the recording and the Zoom call. Thanks everyone for coming and showing up and asking questions. I really appreciate it. And we have a bunch of other webinars going on this month and next month and so on. So please feel free to join those as well. I hope everyone has a great rest of their Tuesday. And yeah, hopefully I will speak to people soon.